What if one of the most effective American weapons in World War I wasn't a bomber, a tank, or a battleship but an ordinary grocery store? It sounds almost impossible. Yet 400s of thousands of German prisoners captured during the war, the first serious challenge to everything they believed didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened when they crossed the Atlantic and encountered everyday American life. For years they had been taught that the United States was a nation in decline, wealthy on the surface perhaps, but divided, and disciplined, and fundamentally incapable of sustaining a long war. According to Nazi propaganda, America's prosperity was an illusion built on social decay, racial division, and economic weakness. German soldiers expected to face an opponent with enormous resources but little determination. What many of them eventually discovered was something entirely different. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States transported nearly 400 German prisoners of war to North America. They were distributed among more than 500 POW camps stretching from Texas and Arizona to Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and the Carolinas. These camps weren't ever intended to serve as ideological classrooms. Their primary purpose was practical: to remove prisoners from the battlefield while helping relieve wartime labor shortages under the rules established by the Geneva Convention. But the camps unintentionally became something else. Without speeches, without forced political instruction, and without carefully designed re-education programs, they exposed thousands of German soldiers to a society that looked nothing like the one described by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. Many prisoners later documented this experience in letters home, private diaries, memoirs, and post-war interviews. Those records reveal a remarkably consistent pattern. Instead of describing harsh imprisonment, many wrote about confusion. Nothing seemed to fit the picture they had carried into captivity. To understand why that mattered, it's necessary to understand the world these men believed existed before they ever arrived in America. For more than a decade, the Nazi regime had invested enormous effort into constructing a complete ideological explanation of the United States. This wasn't simply a collection of exaggerated stories or isolated falsehoods. It was an internally consistent worldview that reinforced every major assumption behind National Socialist ideology. At its core were three fundamental beliefs. The first centered on race. Nazi ideology claimed that national strength depended on racial homogeneity. In that framework, America represented the exact opposite. Official propaganda portrayed the United States as a society weakened by immigration, ethnic diversity, and cultural fragmentation. Newspapers, films, and political speeches repeatedly described America as a country lacking the unity supposedly possessed by Germany. Too many young soldiers. This wasn't political rhetoric. It was presented as scientific certainty. If America lacked racial cohesion, they were told it could never generate the discipline required for total war. The second belief focused on economics. Although the Great Depression had largely ended by the early 1940s, German propaganda continued portraying America as if the crisis had never ended. Images of bread lines, unemployment, and urban poverty remained common in newspapers and newsreels long after American industry had begun its wartime expansion. At the same time, Nazi propaganda contrasted those images with the supposed unity and stability created inside Germany through centralized planning and wartime mobilization. The message was straightforward. America was wealthy only for a privileged elite. Ordinary citizens, they weren't gold, lived in insecurity and selfish individualism rather than national solidarity. The third assumption proved to be the most strategically important. German political and military leaders consistently underestimated American industrial capacity. Even after the United States entered the war, many in Berlin dismissed President Roosevelt's ambitious production goals as unrealistic. Public statements promising tens of thousands of aircraft, tanks, ships, and vehicles each year were often portrayed as propaganda intended to boost Allied morale rather than realistic industrial targets. Many German soldiers sincerely believed those claims. They also believed geography would protect Germany. The Atlantic Ocean, combined with aggressive U-minus boat operations, seemed to make the large-minus scale transport of American armies and equipment nearly impossible. Taken together, these ideas created a remarkably durable worldview. America was divided. Its economy was fragile. Its people lacked discipline. Its industry was exaggerated. Its military power could not be sustained across an ocean. For the average German soldier captured in North Africa or Italy, these weren't opinions waiting to be tested. They were established facts. Being taken prisoner did not necessarily change that belief. Many assumed their capture reflected temporary battlefield circumstances rather than any broader shift in the war, but that confidence would begin to unravel almost immediately, not because of interrogation, not because of political lectures, and not because anyone tried to convince them they were wrong. Instead, the first cracks appeared during a simple train ride across the United States. Looking through the windows, they began seeing evidence that no propaganda ministry had ever prepared them to explain. And that quiet journey across America became the beginning of a psychological campaign unlike anything they had experienced on the battlefield. When the German prisoners finally reached camps scattered across states like Texas, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Colorado, many expected conditions similar to the prison compounds they knew in Europe's scarcity: strict deprivation and constant punishment. Instead, they encountered something that challenged their assumptions before a single political conversation ever took place. The first shock was remarkably ordinary. It was breakfast. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners were supposed to receive food roughly equivalent to that issued to American soldiers stationed at home. The United States followed those rules with surprising consistency. For Washington, this was partly a legal obligation and partly a practical decision. Healthy prisoners could work, while minus-treated prisoners were less likely to create unrest. But for German soldiers who had spent years surviving on wartime rations, the experience carried a completely different meaning. White bread appeared at nearly every meal. Not coarse rye bread mixed with fillers. Not heavily rationed slices saved for special occasions. Soft factory made white bread, available in quantities that many prisoners hadn't seen since before the war. Then came eggs, bacon, beef, chicken, butter, jam, milk, coffee made from actual coffee beans instead of substitutes, and desserts like ice cream or gelatin. To American soldiers, these were ordinary military meals. Too many prisoners. They seemed almost impossible. Several memoirs written after the war described men touching the bread before eating it, almost as if confirming it was real. Others admitted they initially believed the generous meals were temporary, perhaps designed to create a favorable first impression before conditions deteriorated. The deterioration never came. Instead, many prisoners actually gained weight. Some reportedly added 15 or 20 pounds during captivity, an outcome that seemed almost absurd considering that Germany itself was entering one of the worst food shortages of the war. This contrast created an important psychological effect. Food is difficult to dismiss as propaganda. A newspaper can lie. A speech can exaggerate. But a full stomach produces its own evidence. Every meal silently contradicted years of ideological education. The next surprise involved work. According to international law, enlisted prisoners could be assigned to non-minus military labor. The United States desperately needed workers because millions of American men were serving overseas. Leaving farms, lumber camps, food processing plants, and agricultural businesses short of labor, German prisoners filled part of that gap. Across the country they harvested cotton, picked vegetables, cut timber, repaired roads, processed canned foods, and worked on farms that otherwise might not have produced enough crops. Unlike forced labor systems operating elsewhere during the war, these assignments included compensation. The prisoners received Camp Minus issued script currency usable only inside the prison camp. The amount was modest, usually around 80 cents per day depending on the assignment. To Americans, it was simply administrative policy. Too many German soldiers. However, the concept itself seemed strange. They weren't prisoners, yet they were earning wages. Not enough to become wealthy. Certainly, but enough to make purchasing decisions. That distinction mattered psychologically. Instead of existing solely as captives dependent on military authority, they suddenly became participants, however limited, in an economy driven by personal choice. And that choice led directly to one of the most memorable places inside every major camp: the post-exchange. The Camp PX looked ordinary to American personnel. Too many German prisoners. It looked extraordinary. Inside were shelves stocked with products they had either not seen for years or had never seen at all. Candy bars, cigarettes, soap, razors, toothpaste, stationery, magazines, soft drinks, coffee, personal items that in wartime Germany had become rare luxuries or disappeared entirely. Many prisoners tried Coca-Cola for the first time while in captivity. The drink itself wasn't strategically important. What mattered was what it represented. No one forced prisoners to buy it. No political officer stood nearby explaining capitalism. No American guard delivered lectures about democracy. The shelves simply existed, full, every day, and when products disappeared, new ones replaced them. That quiet consistency delivered a far stronger message than any organized propaganda campaign could have achieved. Economists sometimes describe industrial capacity through production statistics: tons of steel, Numbers of vehicles, aircraft output. The prisoners encountered the consumer version of the same phenomenon. If factories could continuously produce chocolate bars, cigarettes, refrigerators, soap, clothing, and thousands of other civilian products during the largest war in history, then perhaps those same factories really could manufacture aircraft, tanks, artillery, trucks, and ammunition on an equally overwhelming scale. The consumer economy and the war economy were not separate systems. They were powered by the same industrial foundation. Many German soldiers had never been encouraged to think about that connection. Now they were living inside it. Minus perhaps the single most influential object inside some POW camps wasn't food or money. It was a catalog. Copies of the Sears Roebuck Mail Minus Order catalog circulated among prisoners, passed from bunk to bunk until the pages became worn. Unlike government publications, the catalog wasn't trying to persuade anyone politically. Its purpose was simple: sell products. Ironically, that made it far more convincing. The prisoners turned page after page in disbelief. Entire sections devoted to household appliances, power tools, kitchen equipment, children's toys, sporting goods, clothing, furniture, fishing gear, musical instruments. Dozens of nearly identical products competing against one another not because they were necessary, but because consumers had preferences. Choice itself became the revelation. For someone raised in an economy increasingly defined by shortages and state control, the catalog described a society operating according to completely different assumptions. Production wasn't focused solely on survival. It was focused on abundance. Some former prisoners later recalled spending hours reading the catalog even though they had no intention or ability to purchase most of what they saw. They weren't studying advertisements. They were studying America. And slowly, often reluctantly, a difficult realization began taking shape. The United States wasn't merely wealthier than Nazi propaganda had claimed. It appeared to possess an industrial system capable of sustaining both extraordinary civilian prosperity and unprecedented military production at exactly the same time. That realization would become even harder to ignore once the prisoners saw how America's factories were actually operating. The camp mess hall challenged the prisoners' assumptions about American living standards, and the PX revealed the scale of American consumer production. The next stage of their experience connected those observations into a much larger and far more unsettling picture. It happened in camp recreation halls. Like many military installations, POW camps regularly showed newsreels and documentary films. Some covered battlefield developments, while others highlighted industrial production and life on the American home front. Their primary audience was American personnel, not German prisoners, but the prisoners watched closely. For many of them, these films answered a question that had been quietly growing since their arrival. Where was all this abundance coming from? The answer appeared on the screen. Factory after factory. Assembly line after assembly line. Aircraft stretching as far as the camera could see. One of the most striking examples was the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, originally designed for automobile manufacturing principles. The enormous facility had been adapted to produce B-24 Liberator bombers on an unprecedented scale. Standardized parts, continuous assembly lines, and highly organized logistics allowed aircraft to roll out with remarkable speed. Two German observers accustomed to smaller, more specialized production methods. The scale seemed almost unbelievable. Nor was aircraft production unique. Newsreels showed shipyards launching Liberty ships one after another. They showed tank factories, truck assembly plants, artillery production, and rail networks moving equipment across the continent. None of this resembled the America described in Nazi propaganda. The supposed industrial bluff was operating in full view. For many prisoners, the realization was deeply unsettling because it explained everything they had already witnessed. The plentiful food, the fully stocked PX, the constant availability of consumer goods, the endless freight trains they had seen during their journey inland. They were not isolated examples of prosperity. They were all products of the same industrial ecosystem. Military historians often describe the Second World War as a conflict decided not only by battlefield tactics, but also by industrial logistics. The prisoners were discovering exactly what that meant. A factory capable of producing millions of refrigerators before the war could manufacture aircraft components after conversion. Automobile plants could build military trucks. Companies that once produced farm machinery could manufacture artillery shells. The strength of American industry wasn't simply the number of factories. It was flexibility. Civilian manufacturing infrastructure could be redirected toward military production without abandoning civilian life entirely. That represented a strategic advantage Germany struggled to match. By 1944, the United States was simultaneously supplying its own armed forces while shipping enormous quantities of equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and numerous allied partners through programs such as Lend-Lease. The logistical burden was staggering, yet from the perspective of many German prisoners, civilian America still appeared remarkably normal. Stores remained stocked, automobiles filled highways, construction continued, electric lights illuminated entire cities every night. The contradiction was difficult to process. Germany had embraced total mobilization years earlier, with civilian consumption increasingly sacrificed to military necessity. America seemed capable of expanding military production without completely dismantling everyday civilian life. That observation challenged one of the central assumptions Nazi ideology had promoted throughout the war: minus for technically trained prisoners, engineers, mechanics, logistics officers, and transportation specialists. The implications became even clearer. Some later recalled paying close attention to railroad operations. The freight trains they observed crossing the country were immense, carrying coal, steel, timber, petroleum, machinery, and manufactured goods over thousands of miles. They began recognizing something military planners understand instinctively. Factories alone do not win wars. Supply systems do. Raw materials had to reach production plants. Finished products had to reach ports. Ships had to cross oceans. Equipment had to arrive at front-line units on schedule. Every link in that chain depended on transportation, organization, and industrial coordination. America appeared capable of operating all those systems simultaneously. From inside a prison camp, prisoners could not calculate precise production statistics. They didn't need to. The evidence surrounded them every day. The trains kept running. The warehouses remained full. The camp kitchens never seemed to run out of supplies. Replacement equipment arrived when needed. Nothing suggested a nation approaching exhaustion. Minus at the same time. Another battle was unfolding inside the camps themselves. Not every prisoner accepted these conclusions. A dedicated minority remained fiercely loyal to National Socialism. Many came from elite military formations or deeply ideological backgrounds and regarded any admission of American strength as dangerous defeatism. According to post-war testimony, these hardliners organized informal disciplinary groups that intimidated fellow prisoners. Men who openly praised American industry or questioned Germany's chances of victory could face threats, beatings, or social isolation. In several camps, suspected collaborators were attacked by fellow Germans. The most notorious case occurred in 1944 at Papago Park Camp in Arizona, where prisoner Werner Drexler was killed after being accused of cooperating with American authorities. The incident highlighted a deeper reality. Even thousands of miles from Europe, the ideological conflict inside Germany had followed its soldiers across the Atlantic. Some prisoners still believed absolute loyalty demanded rejecting everything they witnessed. Others found that increasingly impossible. They didn't necessarily admire the United States. Many retained strong national pride, but facts accumulated faster than ideology could explain them. The industrial evidence was simply too consistent. Every train, every factory, every stock warehouse, every meal, every shipment. Together they pointed toward one unavoidable conclusion. The United States was not winning because of a single superior weapon or one brilliant commander. It was winning because its economy could continuously generate the people. Machines, fuel, food, transportation, and logistics required to sustain global warfare on a scale that few nations had ever imagined. For many German prisoners, that realization marked the true end of the war, long before Germany formally surrendered. They had already concluded that the industrial mathematics no longer favored the Reich and probably never had. Eventually, the war came to an end. Beginning in 1945 and continuing into 1946, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners boarded ships for the journey back across the Atlantic. They left behind the camps where many had spent years working, studying English, reading American newspapers, and quietly reassessing everything they had believed before their capture. The physical journey home was short. The psychological journey was far more complicated. Many returned to cities that no longer existed as they remembered them. Industrial centers had been reduced to rubble. Transportation networks were shattered. Food remained scarce. Families struggled simply to survive another winter. And almost immediately, they were asked the same question. How did Germany lose? Some spoke about Allied air power. Others mentioned the Eastern Front were overwhelming numerical superiority. But a surprising number focused on something much less dramatic. They talked about ordinary American life. They described grocery stores filled with food. Despite global war, They described highways crowded with civilian automobiles. They described factories operating around the clock while consumer goods still remained available. They described mail-order catalogs offering thousands of products that average families could actually afford. For relatives who had spent years living under rationing and constant propaganda, these stories sounded almost unbelievable. Yet they came not from elite broadcasts, but from sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers who had witnessed America firsthand. That made the testimony difficult to dismiss. Military historians often emphasize that wars are decided by strategy, technology, leadership, and battlefield performance. All of those mattered enormously during the Second World War. But underneath every military campaign lies something even more fundamental. Economics. Every tank requires steel. Every bomber requires aluminum, fuel, engines, trained mechanics, replacement parts, and transportation. Every soldier requires food, medicine, clothing, ammunition, and a logistics system capable of delivering all of it on time. Industrial capacity is not simply another advantage. It is the foundation that allows every other military capability to exist. The German prisoners gradually realized that America's consumer economy and America's military economy were not competing with each other. They were the same system. The factories producing refrigerators could also produce aircraft components.